to Superior Cinema, where we watch all the movies. Today is another installment in our series review, this time the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Texas Chainsaw Massacre was made in '74, well, I think '73, it came out in '74. Tobe Hooper, essentially it's a student film, and when you look at it like that, it's better than if you said, oh hey, a big studio had put this together. And also, in '74, the horror market was a little different. It wasn't quite, it hadn't been established in the same way. There were people like the Italian side, especially coming from like the Bava lineage, that were making, giallo or thriller types, but the ground that Texas Chainsaw was treading was very different from that. Now, the original movie is obviously shot very cheap, shot on 16mm film, and apparently, I just read they are doing a 4K restoration of that, so hopefully we'll see a really beautiful release coming out later this year, which is the 40th anniversary. So, Texas Chainsaw is a story of some friends traveling cross-country who encounter some weirdos, eventually end up at the wrong place at the wrong time, and find themselves the victims of some hillbilly Texan cannibals. What works in the film is the subtlety. This is a movie that's often described as horrifically violent and gory and all these other words, and it's not at all. There's hardly any blood even in the movie. But the way Hooper filmed this, it's very moving. It's very real. You feel the characters. It's very dark, grim, and bleak. The subtle nuances of the characters make it even more disturbing, rather than, it's not really a splatter flick. Well, it's not even close to a splatter flick. It's more of a psychological horror movie, because you get the first 45 minutes of the movie, rewatching it, are kind of slow. I mean, they're kind of, okay, the characters are talking, and it does feel like padding to get a feature length. There's not a lot going on. But that does establish who the characters are, and again, it's Hooper's first real full-length film, and I can forgive that. So, at the point we get to the nitty-gritty of it, where they're being taken, it just feels real. Not found footage real, but you can buy into the fact that this is a true story. While supposedly based on Ed Gein, obviously Gein had nothing remotely like this other than the whole dead skin mask thing. You've got a outlandish, yet a story you can buy. I mean, if you ever drove through the middle of nowhere, Texas, or the middle of nowhere anywhere, you could totally believe there's a bunch of cannibals living out there waiting for you. And that's what this really gives you. I mean, the scene where he clubs him over the head and he's twitching, that is landmark, just beautiful brutality, and it doesn't show any gore. That's how you make a horror movie or violent film without showing gore. While Hooper never excels to the level of like a Carpenter, or he did with Halloween, this is pretty damn near close to that level of faking out the audience into the audience imagines something even more horrific than what they're seeing. The girl coming out of the freezer, another great scene. It's similar to a jump scare, but so traumatic that it works. It doesn't feel cheap. The hanging people on the hooks is always a great scene. Love that one. And the grandfather thing, it's just creepy. But it's creepy in it's shocking, but just subtle enough that it's still believable and doesn't go into that splatter or exploitation feel to it. It's a very disturbing movie. Obviously, it's a classic. If you have not seen the original one, you're probably not watching this review, but you should see it. Very good movie. It set the way for a ton of slasher flicks past it, it gets... I mean, this movie is cited by a lot of people, but it often gets overlooked for its influence in the horror genre, and where more people seem to favor the contribution to Carpenter's Halloween. While, again, I love Carpenter and agree, this film was before that, and it had an influence, a very strong influence, and is still regarded as an excellent horror film today. So, it was obviously hugely successful, and in the 70s they didn't do so many sequels like they did starting in the 80s. I mean, if you think about, there's very few sequels pre the 80s that directly continued, which, of course, we had to wait till around 85 to get the follow-up, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Hooper did do this one, and this was after Hooper had some success. Reading a lot of the stories and wiki articles, my understanding is Hooper had a bit of a drug problem, and I think it's kind of evident in this release. He said he didn't want to repeat himself, and I get that. So he wanted to make more of a parody of it, and I get that too. There are parts of this movie that are very cool. They're exciting. Hopper is very entertaining. The problem comes in the actual narrative. The film it's very disjointed. It's kind of hard to follow. There's scenes that just kind of go on, and like there wasn't a distinct focus of where the film was going. So I appreciate that Hooper was trying to do something different, but the weird dancing maneuver that Leatherface does and Hooper does at one point, it just comes off as goofy. Not satirical, but goofy. And I find this one, I still find it a chore to get through. It's not absolutely awful, but it's just not very good either. It's worth watching, and it's definitely better than some of the other later entries. I think it's worth watching just for Hopper's performance alone. It's very entertaining. You can see a lot more money is in this one. It's a much more slick production, but overall, it just doesn't feel like a coherent film. Now, another thing with all the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies is the continuity is shot to holy hell. You could say this is in continuity with the first one, and that's okay. It'll go with it, that's fine, but nobody else puts it in continuity anyway, so it's irrelevant. So watching them in order is interesting to do, but doesn't really matter, except with one exception, and we'll get to that later. There's not really much to say about this. It's an Austin Pan movie, but it's not really that bad. It's just kind of boring would be my complaint. It's a little boring in places. The parodic element would have worked more if it was funnier, but I have a feeling there was a big clash between the actual financiers and Hooper wanting to make it a complete satire, and the financiers wanting a horror sequel. So it ends up kind of being a mess. Now, if you haven't seen it, it's worth checking out because it was Hooper directed, so it's an interesting perspective to see what he thinks of his own work a decade later. That brings us to another almost sequel-ish thing. Leatherface, which Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 3. When this came out in the theaters, it was the R-rated cut. The DVD is unrated. The R-rated cut features 0 blood and has some weird cuts in there that don't make any sense. Weirdly, this movie features Viggo Mortensen in a part, obviously early in his career. And this takes place, obviously, sometime after the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's no mention of the events in Part 2, so we're going to assume they left that out. It focuses more on Leatherface establishing him as like a slasher, like a Jason or a Freddy or a Michael Myers. And I appreciate that. In retrospect, rewatching the movie, I enjoy it more than I did back when it came out. Because you can't compare it to the first one. It does not have those elements. This is a 80s era slasher film. It is what it is, with a low kill count, so that's already a weakness. Now, it does have a strong point, has some Death Angel on the soundtrack. There's a great chase scene where they're playing a board throughout it, and Laz Rocket did the theme song for this, the song actually Leatherface, one of their best songs, which had a music video for it. They even had the soundtrack for it, which I have. It came out from Geffen Records. So a lot of money went into this movie, and I'm not sure what they were thinking, but what you end up with is a mediocre slasher flick without much blood, because again, this is the later 80s, so everything was censored anyway. Even in the unrated version, this is a very tame movie, but it does have Ken Foree in it too. So you got the Ken Foree factor, because he's always cool. His characters should have been in it more, honestly, because the other characters outside of Viggo are kind of boring. And I don't care about him. I want to see Leatherface kill them all, which is good in the vein of a slasher. So it's worth checking this out in the unrated version, especially if you haven't seen it. Not the best. I'll give my ratings on all of them at the end here. But for the series, it's not all that bad. It's still one of the weaker entries, but it's worth seeing. Which brings us to the 90s entry for Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This one is directed by Kim Henkel, who produced the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and has directed no other movie. If you've seen this, you probably know why Henkel has never directed any other movie. I can say one good thing about this movie. Matthew McConaughey. He's brilliant. He's entertaining as all hell. But if he's not on the screen, you're going to be pissed. Zellweger is awful in this movie. Everybody else, the characters are pointless. They removed all the cannibalism. There is zero gore in this movie. I don't even understand the point of this movie. You watch it to watch McConaughey act like a psycho? That's actually pretty cool. Again, but if you add up all the time, you're still talking maybe 20 minutes of the entire film that you get to stare at McConaughey, because if he's not on the screen, it's a bad movie. The acting is horrible. The shots are boring. The story is horrendous. Outside of curiosity, and for the completist, I would say never watch this movie. And in fact, I was working on doing the series of review, got through this movie, which was an effort to even make it all the way through, and then I had to stop for about a month because I was so put off on the entire series I didn't want to watch anymore. So this movie is just, this is a mess. I don't see this unless you absolutely have to, or you're curious what McConaughey is doing in it. He can act even without a good director. But this movie is just a mess on every level. It's worth watching if you want to understand what not to do when making a film, then watch this. It's terrible. Then Platinum Dunes came around and decided to reboot Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The reboot does some interesting stuff with developing the family. What it does in comparison to the original, it corrects the slowness in the beginning. This is a better paced movie, but again, this is done by a much more polished crew. It does not have the realism of the first one. It's not... Whereas the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a psychological nightmare, this is a horror movie. And very distinct differences. So you gotta look at them as that and accept it for what it is and move on. The reboot is pretty good. The extra characters they added, or the way they fleshed out the extra characters, especially Arlie Emery, make it amazing. I mean, watching Arlie Emery in the movie totally sells it for me. I can rewatch it just for his performance because I love him and he's so great in this. I think the reboot, Jessica Biel was... I don't know if she was miscast or her character was poorly written. My big problem with her is she's never afraid. Everybody else in the movie, I believe they're scared. I mean, scared to death of this family. But her, she's way too tough. And this was kind of a trend in the early 2000s with horror movies where people stopped being afraid of killers. And it just doesn't make any sense. There's... The main storyline is basically the same. Except you have more depth with the characters. And the end of it, though, you may remember there's a part where there's some short-haired girl in the family, and she's kidnapped a baby from some other girl that we meet, and Jessica Biel's character goes back to save the baby. I didn't really understand that part, or the subcontext of why the hell I was supposed to care. And since it goes nowhere because there was no sequel, I didn't really get that either. So the ending is kind of a letdown for me. But I really like the character development they did with it, and how it felt like a more solid universe could be built from this. And, of course, they did. They followed this up with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the beginning, a prequel. I'm okay with that. Prequels can be a bit sketchy, and in this case, you'll notice this is the Canadian release, which is unrated. The US release, I'm going to warn, do not get it. The US release is the cut version. Again, we have R. Lee Ermey back. And this is the story that leads up to the family being established. We get how Leatherface's origins and how the family got to be where they are. This is in direct continuity with the reboot. Unlike all the other movies, these are really the only two that actually kind of connect logically and don't violate each other horribly. Again, R. Lee Ermey's in this. He's fantastic. I like this movie a lot. The director, Liebesman, he's done some other movies, and I didn't like any of those. But this one, I really like Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning. It's probably my favorite. If I exclude the nostalgia factor of the original, this is my favorite. It is violent, it is brutal, merciless, and bleak. This is not... This is different than your typical horror movie. It's a prequel, so guess what? If you go into that thinking, hey, wait a second, none of these bad guys can die, can they? So you end up with a very dark storyline. It's fairly relentless. The acting is fantastic. Everybody acts in an appropriate level of fear. They feel this terror from these psychopaths that are gonna essentially torture and then eat them. And I really felt that, especially, there's a scene with R. Lee Ermey and one of the kids where he's making him do push-ups and just beating him. I mean, it's something like a bad dream from Full Metal Jacket character kind of thing, and it's just savage. I mean, that scene alone, it's worth watching the movie for that. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan of R. Lee Ermey anyway. But this, I like the violence in this movie. The gore is over the top, and it's mean, it's vicious. The characters have depth, and it's an all-around fun flick. You're not going to smile at the end of it, but I like it. I like the fact that it went as dark as possible, and that bleakness really set the tone for me, and that's what kind of puts it on par with the original to me, is that bleak feeling, that sense of hopelessness. While Hooper gave us an out at the end of the original, this doesn't even give you that, so it's very dark. Now, of course, after this one, they went ahead and rebooted again. Well, reboot-ish, but the characters in this, in the reboots, are really fantastic. If you haven't had a chance, check out the collected editions from Avatar Comics or DC Wildstorm. They continued a lot of the stories with these characters. They are the characters from the Platinum Dunes remakes, and they're really good stories. I mean, I don't know, if you don't read comics, maybe you won't get into them, but if you do, they're actually pretty cool. They kind of delve, there's a lot of prequels, a lot of backgrounds for each character, where they do little miniseries for each character. There's also some stories after, there's stories before, during, And all of them are really kind of fun. I highly recommend checking out those comics. You can get them in collected editions or the original issues if you want. Most of them are still in print, but they flesh out the stories to the characters and continue some of them. So you get an idea of what we might have seen if they would have continued on this series, but they didn't. So, last year we got Texas Chainsaw 3D! And for reasons I don't understand, they went ahead and rebooted again. This is effectively Texas Chainsaw 2 if you were continuing off of the original Texas Chainsaw. But the continuity problems doing that are really sketchy. Now, I like this movie, so I'm going to start saying I really actually like it. However, the ties they wanted to give me to the first one, the opening scene of this movie takes place with them going to the house, which of course looks nothing like the other house. And the person I was watching it with said, wait, did they buy a new house? I'm like, no, they just couldn't find a house that looked close enough, because it doesn't look anything like the house from the original movie. And a group of the people from town come in and they want to get rid of these people, and all of a sudden there's a ton of people in this house. Now, I like that Gunnar Hansen is one of them. That's cool. It's a cool wink, but as far as a narrative, it doesn't make any sense. Who are all these people in this house? Which one is supposed to be the uncle? Where's the grandfather? I don't get it. Who's the baby? What? So while I understand they wanted to continue it from the first one, if you're going to do that shitty of a job, don't show the scene. Just say, yeah, it's after the first one, move on. And they wanted to establish the sheriff and stuff, and whatever. So let's ignore all of the horrific continuity problems that they established in the first 8 minutes of the movie, and we'll move on with that. Alexandra Daddario is the star of this movie. She plays the unknown cousin of Leatherface, and she was a survivor from the whole house being burned down, and some family took her away and raised her as their own. And she finds out that her grandmother has died and inherits a house. Now, apparently, somehow, the Sawyers is what they're called, although they were Hewitts in the other movies. I don't understand the surname things, confuses the crap out of me. Apparently, nobody wanted a continuity between surnames. But they're insanely rich somehow. At least her grandmother is. She owns this monstrous mansion out in the woods, and Daddario receives a notice that, oh, I can go here. So she goes there, and there's a secret letter which she never reads. Come to find out, Leatherface lives in the basement of this house. So that you can probably figure out. The rest, I'm going to do some little spoiling in here. A lot of people have complained about this movie, and I even have a friend who didn't make it halfway through and said it was stupid. I kind of agree with him if you don't watch the end of the movie. What I like is, I mean, all the bad guys are very obvious. You know what's going to happen. There are some nice kills, some really good gore. The 3D is kind of cool. The ending is what made it for me, and what I liked about the fact they were making a different movie. They said, well, let's make a Texas Chainsaw remake, but let's do something a little different this time. And at the end of the movie, big spoiler warning, if you haven't seen it, watch it, come back to this part. At the end of the movie, Daddario's character finally embraces who she is as a Sawyer, and Leatherface figures out who she is as his cousin and becomes her protector. So it goes from a stalker horror movie to a My Pet Monster movie. Leatherface being the monster. Now, in this also, they establish that Leatherface is, they don't ever say, but he's mentally handicapped in some manner. One of the things by doing that changes the whole complex of the movie and makes this okay to me. Him being her protector and pet monster is okay because he doesn't understand that he's evil or bad or killing people, because he doesn't have the mental capacities to understand this. He was raised this way, which makes him not a villain per se, but more of an unwitting accomplice in these activities. So what you get is a really different take on the story. And I liked it. It was fun to me. Plus, Daddario's got just great talent budding with her shirt, which seemed to be taped at the end there. Great last scene. So I like what they did with it, because if you're going to reboot these things, I always prefer you do something different. Anytime you keep on the same track, it's just, you either end up with a shot-for-shot remake, which is going to be inferior to the original, like Psycho, or it's just a mess of a movie, which makes remakes pointless. The Texas Chainsaw series didn't need to be rebooted. You can just keep continuing on with these. Considering none of them had any continuity besides the Platinum Dunes 2, it didn't really matter anyway. So, to me, this is just a later story with a slightly different angle. The first part could have been gone, but I did like it. If you're willing to accept some differences and you like the idea of the My Pet Monster concept, I think you can have a kick out of it. I thought it was fun. So, that is all of them. Let's go ahead and review the individual releases. Part 1, the movie itself, I give a 9 out of 10. It has some roughness to it, but it is a classic. And this release, I'm going to give a 9 out of 10 as well. There's no special packaging, but it's got a ton of features, and this is the best print you're going to see until that 4K scan comes out. If that 4K scan is what I'm hoping it'll be, they could slap it with the same extras and I'd give it a 10. 2. This one has a lot of extras. It's nice. Print is pretty good. You're not going to see much better. I would give the movie, I'm only going to give a 4 out of 10. I don't particularly like it. However, the release, I would give a 8.5 out of 10. The Arrow release from England, however, also comes with Tobe Hooper's original short film and another full-length feature that he made prior to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So, I'm going to eventually buy the Arrow release of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, and I would give that one a much higher score, probably a 9.5, simply because it's more complete and has all the same extras this does. Part 3, Leatherface. The movie, I'll give it a 5 out of 10. I can get through it. Nothing special, nothing to write home about. This does have the unrated version. It does have some nice extras, good little interviews. The picture quality is kind of bad, even for a DVD. I mean, you can see a lot of artifacting, so I'm only going to give the release a 6 out of 10, but there's no better version, so that's what you're stuck with. Next Generation, the movie. 2 out of 10 for McConaughey. 2 points for McConaughey. Only for McConaughey. That's it. The rest of the movie's god-awful. The release, crap too. Nothing in the way of extras. The video quality is awful. So 3 out of 10 on the release. There's no other version. I don't know if anybody cares to restore this, so that may be the only way you can see it. The reboot. I will give the reboot a 7 out of 10 on the movie. And the release is pretty darn good. It's got a lot of extras, tons of commentary, so 9 out of 10 on the release. Texas Chainsaw The Beginning. The movie, I will give a 9 out of 10. I really like this one. The release, make sure you get the Canadian. It is unrated. Do not get the US version. However, there ain't jack in the way of extras, so I'll give it a 6 out of 10 just because this is the unrated version. Remember, get the unrated version, double check. It's from Alliance. It is not the US release. And lastly, Texas Chainsaw 3D. I will give the movie itself a 7.5 out of 10. I do like it. The release, 10. 10 out of 10. First, check out this freaking awesome cover. 3D lenticular Leatherface. It's awesome. And the extras, holy crap! I mean, for a movie that didn't do that big in the box office, it's got everything. There's 3 commentary tracks, tons of making of features. With Hooper, it does one of the commentary tracks. He's in the interviews, Gunner's in the interviews, Sally from the original movie does commentary and is in the interviews. And it's got 3D and 2D on it, so whichever one you want. This is a fantastic release. I wish every small indie horror movie went through the effort of making this kind of release for their thing. I'm really impressed with it. Plus, his cover is freaking sweet. I don't think you can see that here, but this is a great release. This is what I wish everybody would do. So there you have it. That's the Texas Chainsaw series. I'm going to be looking to do some more series reviews. Not as many of them have very long runs, which is kind of making it tough to figure out which ones to do. I mean, I can do non-horror stuff like James Bond, but dear Lord, really? Or Godzilla? I mean, kind of hard to do in one video. But if you have any recommendations, post them on here and I will do my best to get to them. I hope you liked our review of Texas Chainsaw, and check them all out. Let me know what you think. What are your personal ratings? And we'll see you here next time in Movie Mayhem.